The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was already a bad sign. Eliza Hartwell had learned, in the particular way that women who have survived too much tend to learn things, that Tuesdays carried a specific kind of cruelty. Her mother had died on a Tuesday. The school board had voted on a Tuesday. And now, standing in the ash and ruin of the only classroom she had ever called her own, she held a letter dated Tuesday, October 4th, and read the words of Superintendent Gerald Fitch, a man who had smiled at her face and buried a knife in her back, with a steadiness she did not feel. Miss Hartwell, given the circumstances surrounding the destruction of the Millfield schoolhouse and the questions that have naturally arisen regarding the safety protocols under your supervision, the board has unanimously decided to terminate your contract effective immediately. We wish you well in future endeavors. He had not even used the word fire, as though the building had simply disappeared, as though 37 children had not stood in a field at dawn, coughing smoke from their lungs while Eliza counted heads with trembling hands, counting twice, then 3 times, because she could not bring herself to stop until she was certain every last one of them was breathing. And now this. If you have ever had someone take the one thing you were good at, the one thing you had built yourself around, and reduce it to 2 paragraphs on county letterhead, then you already know what the next few seconds felt like for Eliza. And if you haven't, ask yourself, what would you do if everything you'd earned was taken from you by someone who never once got their hands dirty? Because that is exactly where our story begins. Before we go any further, if this kind of story moves you, if it makes you feel something real, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Every single story we tell here is built for people who still believe in honesty, dignity, and hard-earned love. Drop a comment below and tell me the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it touches your heart, a like costs you nothing but means everything to us. Now, let's go back to Eliza. The morning the schoolhouse burned, Eliza had been awake since 4. That was not unusual. She had been waking at 4 for the better part of 11 years, ever since she had taken the position at Millfield, where the winters came early and the coal stove in the back corner of the one-room schoolhouse needed an hour to chase the frost from the windows before the children arrived. She had never minded it. There was something she loved about that hour before the world started demanding things from her. The quiet, the particular smell of wood smoke and chalk dust, the way the early light came through the eastern window and made the alphabet cards on the wall look almost golden. She had been organizing the reading primers on the morning of the fire when she smelled it. Not wood smoke. Something different. Heavier. The kind of smell that sits in your chest. She had moved fast. Faster than a woman who had spent 11 years behind a desk had any right to move. She had gotten every child out, every single one. She had gone back twice. Once for Thomas Aldridge, who was 9 years old and had hidden under his desk because he was afraid of the sound the burning rafters made, and once for the box of family letters that Margaret Purcell kept in her desk drawer because her mother had sent them from Ohio, and they were the only things the girl had left of her. The box. She had gone back into a burning building for a 9-year-old boy and a dead woman's letters. And Gerald Fitch had written 2 paragraphs about safety protocols. She did not cry reading the letter. She had used up most of her crying in the weeks that followed the fire, alone in the boarding house room she could no longer afford, lying on a cot that smelled like someone else's grief. By the time Fitch's letter arrived, Eliza had moved past the stage where tears came easily. She was operating in a place beyond that, a hard, quiet, dangerous kind of calm that the people who knew her best would have recognized as the thing she did when she had run out of options and was forcing herself to think clearly anyway. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. Then she sat down at the small table by the window and did not move for a long time. Outside, a woman named Dora Finch was hanging laundry and singing something off-key to herself. A dog barked twice. A wagon passed in the street, its wheels grinding slowly through the mud that never quite dried in October. Life continued at its ordinary pace, indifferent to the fact that Eliza Hartwell's had just been knocked off its axis for the second time in as many months. She was 34 years old, she had no family living, she had $12.42 in a tin box under her cot. She had a teaching certificate that a school board had just made worthless, and a reputation that was already being quietly ruined by people who hadn't been inside that building when it burned. She had heard the whispers. She was not naive about what was being said. Careless. That was the word that kept circulating, passed from mouth to mouth the way unpleasant words always travel. Quietly, with a kind of satisfied speed. Careless woman. Irresponsible. Left the stove unattended. She had not left the stove unattended. She had checked it at 4 in the morning, the way she checked it every morning. The investigation, such as it was, had never concluded what started the fire. But conclusions, Eliza had learned, had very little to do with truth when the right people wanted a particular story to stick. The thing about being a woman without money or family or a husband's name to shelter behind, the thing nobody tells you plainly, is that you are always one bad Tuesday away from having nothing. You can work harder than the men beside you. You can be more careful, more prepared, more competent. And it will not matter, not even a little bit, if someone with a county title and a grudge decides you're the convenient explanation for something that went wrong. Eliza knew this. She had always known it, in the abstract way that women of her generation knew most hard truths, as theory, not yet as lived experience. Now she knew it the other way. She made herself eat something, a biscuit left over from breakfast, cold and slightly stale. She chewed it without tasting it and stared at the water stain on the ceiling above her bed and tried to think about what came next. What came next turned out to be a notice pinned to the community board at the general store. She had not been looking for it. She had gone to the store to price potatoes because potatoes were cheap and filling, and she needed to figure out how many weeks she could make $12 stretch if she was careful. She had been standing in the entrance, adjusting to the dim light, when the paper caught her eye. Small print. Handwritten in careful, deliberate letters by someone who clearly meant every word. Seeking a capable woman of good character for a household and ranch position in Iron Hollow, Wyoming territory. The arrangement is formal and respectful, room and board provided. No prior experience required beyond honesty and a willingness to work. Those interested may write to Silas Mercer, Iron Hollow Ranch, Clearwater County. She read it 3 times. School. Then she took out the stub of pencil she always kept in her coat pocket. Old habit, teachers never stop carrying pencils. And she wrote down the address on the back of Gerald Fitch's letter. She was not romantic about it. She understood what this kind of notice usually meant. She had known 2 women who had answered similar advertisements, and she knew the way those arrangements typically unfolded, the woman arriving to find the reality considerably grimmer than the words on paper. She was not foolish enough to believe the phrase formal and respectful at face value. Those words could mean anything, but $12.42 could only mean one thing. She wrote the letter that evening. She did not flatter herself or embellish her circumstances. She wrote the plain facts: her age, her education, her 11 years of teaching experience, the end of that position, and her availability. She mentioned that she was practical, organized, capable of hard work, and that she had no illusions about frontier living. She did not mention the fire. She did not mention Gerald Fitch. She did not mention that she was, at this precise moment in her life, scared in a way she had never allowed herself to be scared before. She sealed the envelope and mailed it the next morning. 3 weeks passed. She sold her winter coat to cover the next 2 weeks of rent, telling herself the Wyoming weather would sort itself out later, and wore 2 shawls pinned together over her dress instead. She took in mending work from a woman on the next street who looked at her with that particular expression, pity wearing the mask of generosity, and said nothing about it because the alternative was refusing the work, and she was past the point of pride. The reply came on a Thursday, which she allowed herself to consider a small improvement over Tuesdays. Miss Hartwell, your letter was straightforward, and that is what I value. The position is genuine. If you are willing to make the journey to Iron Hollow, I will arrange for your travel expenses to be sent ahead. You should know that this is an isolated place, and the work is real, not decorative. If you arrive and find the situation unsuitable, I will not hold you to anything. The choice would remain yours. Silas Mercer. She read that last sentence 4 times. The choice would remain yours. She could not have explained, not adequately, what those 5 words did to her. She had spent 11 years in a profession where other people made every significant decision about her circumstances while she was simply expected to absorb the consequences. She had survived a fire and a letter and 3 weeks of quiet near desperation and the particular humiliation of charity from someone who pitied her. And here was a stranger in Wyoming, a man she had never met, whose face she couldn't picture, whose character she could not possibly verify. And he had written those 5 words like they were ordinary, like a woman having the final say in her own life was simply the natural order of things. She wrote back the same afternoon. I accept. Thank you for the clarity. She did not sleep well that night. That was honest. She lay awake running through every possible version of what waited for her at Iron Hollow Ranch, and none of the versions were simple, and at least 2 of them were genuinely frightening. She was not naive. She was going to a stranger's property in an isolated corner of Wyoming territory with no family to check on her and no real recourse if things went wrong. She knew this, but she also knew what staying looked like. And staying was its own kind of frightening. The train ride took 3 days. She spent most of it in a window seat with her small traveling bag on her lap, watching the landscape change around her in ways that felt almost aggressive. The comfortable, familiar green of the east giving way to something wider and harder and less forgiving. By the time the train pulled into the nearest station to Clearwater County, the sky was the particular shade of gray that means weather is coming, and the wind had a bite to it that her 2 shawls were not remotely prepared for. She was the only passenger who got off. A man was waiting by a wagon at the far end of the platform. He wasn't what she'd pictured, though she would have been hard-pressed to explain exactly what she had pictured. He was older than she'd assumed from the letter, perhaps 10 years her senior, with the kind of face that has spent too much time in harsh weather and been altered by it in ways that were not entirely unpleasant. He wasn't tall. He wasn't particularly broad. He was just present. That was the word that came to her as she walked toward him. He had the quality of someone who took up exactly the space they occupied, and no more. He saw her coming and took off his hat, not as a performance, just a thing he did. Miss Hartwell. Mr. Mercer. They shook hands like 2 people completing a business transaction, which was, after all, what this was. He took her bag without asking and put it in the wagon bed and offered her a hand up to the bench seat. She took it. They did not speak much on the road to Iron Hollow, and she did not find the silence as uncomfortable as she expected. He drove the horses with a focused, quiet economy of movement that told her he had made this journey many times and had no need to perform confidence about it. The landscape spread around them in that enormous, slightly alarming way that wide-open country has, the kind of space that makes a person feel simultaneously small and somehow more visible than usual. The road gets rougher in another mile, he said eventually. I'm sorry for it. I grew up on a farm, she said. I know what rough roads feel like. He nodded, like that settled something. The ranch came into view as the light was failing, a cluster of buildings that looked like they had been placed by someone with practical intentions rather than aesthetic ones, surrounded by fence lines that went off in every direction and faded into the gray distance. It was not beautiful. It was functional, and there is a kind of honesty to functionality that she appreciated. He showed her inside without ceremony. The main house was larger than she expected, and colder. She could see immediately that it had been a long time since anyone had done much with it beyond the bare minimum of upkeep. Not dirty, exactly, just emptied of something, like a room that had once had a fire burning in it and hadn't for a while. I expect you're tired, he said. I'm fine. He looked at her for a moment, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, more in the way of someone taking an honest measurement. Then he said, I've got a spare room. She didn't answer immediately, which was unlike her. She was, in the ordinary way of things, a quick-thinking woman with a ready response. But something about those 5 words, said so quietly, without preamble, without any particular weight attached to them, hit her somewhere she hadn't expected to be hit. I've got a spare room. Not, here are your duties. Not, here's what I expect. Not, here are the conditions. Just that. A room. Available. Offered. She felt something move through her chest that she could not quite name and was not quite ready to examine. Her eyes went sharp with something she forced back down before it could embarrass her. She cleared her throat and pressed her fingernails into her palm, a thing she had done since childhood when she needed to stay composed. And she nodded. That'll do, she said. It was not what she meant. What she meant was considerably larger than those 3 words. But 3 words were what she had available right then, and she held on to them. He showed her the room. It was on the south side of the house, Good light, she would realize later, once the sun was up. There was a bed with a quilt on it, a small dresser, a window that looked out toward the furthest fence line. Someone had recently put a candle on the dresser. The wax was not yet melted. He set her bag down by the door and said goodnight and closed the door behind him with a click so soft she barely heard it. Eliza stood in the middle of the room for a full minute without moving. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, carefully, like she was afraid it might not hold her. She put her hands flat on her knees. She looked at the wall. She thought about Gerald Fitch's letter, about the whispers, about 3 weeks of eating biscuits and wearing 2 shawls and taking mending work from a woman who looked at her with pity, about standing on a train platform in Wyoming with the wrong clothes for the weather and nowhere else in particular to be. And she thought about a man she had known for less than 3 hours who had said the choice would remain yours and I've got a spare room, and had meant both of them the same way, plainly, without agenda, like it was simply the thing you said to a person who needed it. She did not cry. She pressed her fingernails into her palm and breathed deliberately, and refused, on principle, to cry. But it was the closest she had come in a very long time. Outside the window, the wind was picking up. She could hear it moving around the edges of the house, finding the gaps, looking for a way in the way wind always does in open country. She pulled the quilt over her legs and looked at the candle on the dresser, still unlit, but waiting. She did not know, sitting in that room on that first night, what Iron Hollow would cost her. She did not know about the gossip that was already forming in town, or about Grant Holloway and his quiet, well-dressed ambitions, or about the letter she would one day find in a drawer and misread in the worst possible way. She did not know about any of it. She only knew that she was warm, that there was a door she could close, that no one had handed her a list of obligations or a set of conditions or a reason to be grateful that was actually a leash. She only knew that she had not felt safe in a very long time, and that she was not certain she felt safe now, but that something in this house was not trying to harm her. And after the years she had lived through, that distinction felt enormous. She blew out the unlit candle, an old habit, always conserving, and lay down on top of the quilt with her coat over her like a blanket, because she had sold the real one, and closed her eyes. The choice would remain yours, he had written. She kept those words with her as she drifted off, holding them with the same careful attention she had once given to a box of letters in a burning building, like they were something worth going back for, even when the going back was frightening. Outside, Iron Hollow settled into the dark. The wind moved through the fence lines and across the open land and did not stop for anything, and Eliza Hartwell, for the first time in months, slept. She woke before the sun did. That was not a surprise. What surprised her was waking up in a bed that didn't smell like someone else's grief, in a room where the walls held still, in a silence that had nothing threatening inside it. For approximately 4 seconds, she lay in that unfamiliar quiet and felt almost peaceful. Then the cold hit her properly, a deep, settled cold that had been sitting in the walls of Iron Hollow Ranch for what felt like years, and she was up. She had not unpacked the night before. She had been too tired, and there was something in her that still needed a night's sleep before committing to anything, even the act of opening a bag. Old habit. Don't unpack until you know if you're staying. It had served her at 3 different boarding houses and 2 temporary teaching assignments, and she saw no reason to abandon it now. She dressed quickly, wrapped one of the shawls around her shoulders, and found her way to the kitchen by memory and the smell of something burning. Silas Mercer was standing at the stove with his back to her, apparently in a contest with a cast iron pan that he appeared to be losing. The smell was coffee, or what had once intended to be coffee before something went wrong in the middle of the process. He heard her footsteps and turned around with an expression that was not quite embarrassed but was close. "I was going to have it ready," he said. She looked at the pan. She looked at him. "What happened to it?" "I got distracted." She did not ask what had distracted him. She moved him aside with a motion that was practical rather than rude, the same motion she had used 1,000 times in a classroom when a child was standing in front of the supply cabinet she needed, and took stock of what was available. The coffee grounds were salvageable. The pan needed washing. There were eggs somewhere, and she found them on a shelf near the window, and biscuits from the previous day that were hard but not hopeless. "Sit down," she said. Not unkindly, just efficiently. He sat. She could feel him watching her work, not in the way that made her skin prickle, the way men sometimes watched women doing domestic tasks, assessing, calculating what it was worth, but in the way of someone watching something unfamiliar and trying to understand it. She focused on the eggs and let him look. "You cook like you've done it under pressure," he said eventually. "I taught school for 11 years with one coal stove and a leaky roof. You learn to make things work with what's in front of you." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Why did you stop teaching?" She cracked the third egg. "I didn't stop. I was stopped." She didn't elaborate and he didn't push, and she was grateful for that in a specific way that she logged somewhere in the back of her mind. The way you log small things that end up mattering more than you expected. They ate at the kitchen table with the particular awkwardness of two strangers who have agreed to share a life but haven't figured out the daily mechanics of it yet. The eggs were plain, the biscuits were better warmed, the coffee was acceptable, which was already an improvement. He drank it without comment. She noticed he drank it black and that he ate quickly, like a man who had spent years eating alone and had lost the habit of making meals last. When he was done, he stood up and said, "I'll show you around the operation this morning if that suits." "It suits," she said. What she saw that morning told her several things simultaneously. The ranch was larger than she'd assumed from the darkness of arrival, a substantial spread of pasture and outbuilding and fence line that represented real money invested over real years. The livestock were healthy, the equipment was well maintained. But the interior workings of the operation had the specific disorder of a system run by one person who had too many things to think about and not enough hours, and had quietly let the organizational side of things slip while keeping the visible parts functional. She did not say any of this. She asked questions. Where were the supply records kept? What rotation did he use for the southern pasture? How did he track what went out to market and what came back? He answered directly, without defensiveness, which she also noted. "The record keeping," he said at one point, with something that might have been reluctance, "could be better." "I can see that," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "You're not gentle about it." "Would gentle help the records?" He made a sound she would later recognize as his version of a laugh, short, dry, arrived and departed quickly. "No," he said. "I don't suppose it would." That was how it started, the daily work of Iron Hollow Ranch under Eliza Hartwell's attention. Not dramatically. Not with announcements or declarations. Just a woman who had spent 11 years making order out of chaos in a one-room schoolhouse, now applying the same instincts to a different kind of disorder. She reorganized the supply shed in a single afternoon, working until the light failed and her back ached in a way she refused to acknowledge. She set up a ledger system for the livestock records that Silas could maintain without it consuming his whole morning. She found that the kitchen pantry had been restocked without any particular logic, things purchased and stacked wherever there was space, and spent a Saturday morning sorting it into a system so simple even a distracted man could find the salt. Silas watched all of this with a careful neutrality that she couldn't quite read. He didn't interfere. He didn't object. But he also didn't thank her. Not in those first weeks, and there were moments when she caught him watching her work with an expression that sat somewhere between appreciation and something more complicated, like a man watching a river change course through his property and not yet having decided whether that was a problem. She was not trying to take over, she was trying to be useful. That was a distinction that mattered to her, and she held on to it when she felt the old familiar doubt beginning to whisper, the doubt that said she was overstepping, that she was making herself at home in a place where she had not been invited to be at home, that she was, once again, doing too much and making herself difficult to live with. She had been told that before, by a school board, by the women in Millfield who had watched her run her classroom with more authority than they thought appropriate, by a man she had almost married 6 years ago who had said, not unpleasantly, that she was a lot to manage. She thought about that phrase sometimes, in the quiet evenings when Silas was doing the last walk of the property and she was sitting with her mending by the lamp. A lot to manage. She had never been able to decide if it was an insult or just an accurate description. November came in with its teeth already out. The temperature dropped fast and stayed down. The morning walks to the barn became something to get through rather than something to notice. She started wearing her second shawl over the first and told herself again that she would think about a proper coat soon. Silas noticed. Of course he did. She wasn't sure when she'd started to understand that he noticed most things, that his quietness was not the same as inattention, that somewhere behind those measured silences was a man who was taking careful inventory of everything around him. He just didn't announce what he noticed. What he did, 2 days into November, was leave a coat at the end of the kitchen table before she came down in the morning. A heavy wool coat, brown, with a fleece lining. No note, no mention of it at breakfast. Just a coat on the table as though it had always been there and she was only just now seeing it. She picked it up. She looked at him across the table. He was looking at his coffee. "This yours?" she asked. "No." "Then whose is it?" "Yours, I'd say." She held it for a moment. "I didn't ask for a coat." "No," he agreed. "You didn't." She put it on. It was slightly too big in the shoulders and exactly right everywhere else, and she did not ask him how he had known her size because there are questions you do not ask when the honest answer might make you feel too much. "Thank you," she said. "The cold out here is different than you're used to," was all he said back. "It earns respect." That was the end of it. The first time she went into town was a Wednesday in mid-November, riding along with Silas on the supply run. She had needed to go eventually. There were things the ranch required that she could identify better than he could, and she had a small amount of money of her own left that she wanted to spend with some intention before it was entirely gone. He had not suggested she come. She had simply said she was coming, and he had said all right, and that had been the whole negotiation. Clearwater was not large. It had the particular compactness of a frontier town that had grown around necessity rather than planning, a main street with a general store and a post office, and a saloon and a church at one end, and houses spreading out from that center the way things spread when there's room for them to. People moved along the boardwalk with the purposeful pace of people who have too much to do before dark, and paid attention to the arriving wagon with the particular sharpness of a small community that still considers a new face worth examining. She felt the examination. She was practiced at not showing it. Silas walked her into the general store with his usual undemonstrative efficiency, introduced her to the man behind the counter, whose name was Harold Pruitt, and who shook her hand with an enthusiasm that seemed slightly more than the occasion required, and then moved off to collect what was on his list, leaving her to her own errand. She was in the dry goods section, comparing the weights of 2 bolts of practical fabric, when she heard it, not directed at her. 2 women near the window, their voices low enough to have the quality of whispers but not actually whispering, which she recognized as a choice, not an oversight. "Mercer's mail-order woman," I heard. "Well, I heard she left her last position under a cloud." Something about... She did not catch the rest of it because Harold Pruitt appeared at her elbow to ask if she needed help, and she directed her full attention toward him with a brightness that she did not feel, and said yes. Actually, could he tell her about the quality of this particular wool? She talked to him for 3 minutes about fabric weight and completely failed to hear whatever else the 2 women said. In the wagon on the way back, she said nothing about it. Silas glanced at her twice and said nothing either. She appreciated that. She was not yet ready to discuss it, and she suspected, without being entirely certain, that he already knew what small towns said about women who arrived alone to live on a man's ranch without a proper wedding first. What she wasn't prepared for was Grant Holloway. She met him the following week at the general store again, which she had gone to alone this time on an errand for bootlace and lamp oil. She was at the counter paying when she heard her name, her full name, which no one in Clearwater had used yet except Harold Pruitt when he was writing down the Mercer account. "Miss Hartwell, isn't it?" She turned. The man standing behind her was well-dressed in the specific way that announces money without appearing to try, which is the most expensive kind of well-dressed there is. He was perhaps 40, with good teeth and the practiced ease of a man who had long ago learned that his physical presence was an asset and had built habits around deploying it. Not unpleasant to look at. She had known men like this before, had almost been taken in by one. "I'm Grant Holloway," he said. "I own the Crescent Bell, just north of Iron Hollow." He extended his hand in the direction of a handshake, not offering to take her hand the way some men did, which would have annoyed her, just presenting the option. She took it briefly. "I've heard of you," she said, which was technically true. Silas had mentioned the neighboring ranch in the context of a boundary dispute that had been settled 3 years ago, and had said nothing else, which in retrospect told her more than a longer speech would have. "I've heard of you as well," Holloway said pleasantly. Silas Mercer's lucky to have found someone willing to manage that place. It's been showing the strain for a while. He paused. He works hard, just hard in one direction. He works in every direction that matters, she said. Something moved across Holloway's expression. He recovered it quickly, but she had been watching for it. Of course, he said. I understood what you meant, Mr. Holloway. He smiled. It was a good smile, the kind that had probably opened a lot of doors for him. I imagine you did. You strike me as someone who understands things quickly. He paid for his own goods at the counter. He had been waiting to pay, she realized, having timed his introduction precisely, and then said, as he turned to go, If you ever find Iron Hollow isn't what you were looking for, Miss Hartwell, you might find Clearwater County has more to offer than one ranch. I run a good operation, always room for capable people. He left before she could respond, which was also a choice, not an oversight. She stood at the counter for a moment after he was gone. Harold Pruitt was very interested in his ledger book. He always like that? She asked. Harold looked up. Pretty much, he said carefully. She paid for the bootlace and lamp oil and walked out into the cold and stood in the street for a moment, breathing the sharp air, thinking. Holloway had not said anything she could point to as directly hostile. He had been, by most measurements, cordial. But cordiality, she had learned, was sometimes just malice with better tailoring. She thought about the two women in the store and their deliberate not quite whispering. She thought about Under a Cloud. She thought about the way Holloway had said he works in one direction with such careful sympathy, like a man laying groundwork. She was not alarmed, not yet, but she was paying attention now in a different way. When she got back to the ranch, Silas was repairing a section of fence in the near pasture. She could see him from the house. The particular set of his shoulders that meant he was concentrating on something physical and was not thinking about anything else. She had started to recognize his silhouettes, the way you recognize the silhouettes of people you see every day, not because you're watching for them, but because they become part of the landscape of your routine. She put the lamp oil away and sat down at the kitchen table with the ledger and worked on the month's accounts until he came in for supper. She thought about telling him about Holloway. She decided against it, not because she was keeping a secret, but because she did not yet know what there was to tell. A man had been cordial and offered a job she had not asked about. That was not a crisis. She was good at not escalating things before she understood them. What she did not know, could not have known, sitting at that table with the accounts spread in front of her, was that Grant Holloway had been making very different calculations for much longer than she had been in Clearwater County. She would come to understand this later, in the specific way that you understand a chess game better once someone has already taken several of your pieces. The weeks between November and the end of the year had their own texture. The work was consistent and sometimes hard, and occasionally satisfying in the way that work is satisfying when you can see what it produces. She reorganized the winter feed storage based on a system she worked out by herself on the back of an envelope. She rewrote the supply ledger going back 18 months, which took her 4 evenings, and revealed that they had been paying 17 cents per unit too much for oats from one supplier without ever noticing. She told Silas. He looked at the figures. He looked at her. 4 evenings, he said. 3.5, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I would not have caught that. You had other things to catch. He looked at her again in that measuring way. I'm not sure that's the right frame for it. What's the right frame? That I wasn't looking, he said. And you were. She turned back to the ledger because it was easier than whatever the alternative was. There was a particular evening in December that she thought about afterward, more than she intended to. They had both ended up in the kitchen later than usual, she finishing a letter to a woman in Millfield who had been kind to her. He apparently incapable of going to bed at a normal hour without a reason she had never asked about. The lamp was between them on the table. Outside, the wind was doing something theatrical to the fence lines. Do you mind it? He asked. The quiet. She considered the question seriously, the way he had apparently learned she considered things. No. I minded a particular kind of noise back where I was. This is different. What kind of noise? People deciding things about me. She said it simply, without self-pity. Loud opinions about what I was and what I'd done and what I'd be good for. It gets tiring. He was quiet for a moment. I heard some of that's followed you here. She looked up. What did you hear? That you were careless. That the school burned because of it. She held very still. And what do you think? I think a woman who reorganized my entire supply shed in a single afternoon without breaking anything or losing a single item is not a careless woman, he said. And I think anyone who goes back into a burning building twice is not a careless woman either. She had not told him about going back in twice. She had not told anyone in Clearwater County. Where did you hear that? The boy, he said. Thomas Aldridge. His father is the farrier. Came out last month to reshoe the horses. We got to talking. She looked at the table. She was pressing her fingernails into her palm again, and she made herself stop. People believe what makes a better story, she said finally. Some people, he said. Not all of them. She could not look at him right then. The lamp made everything in the kitchen a little warmer than it actually was, and the wind was loud outside, and she was 34 years old and she had spent most of the last year being something other people had decided about, and she was very tired of it, and he had just said something that she did not know how to receive gracefully. I'm going to bed, she said. All right, he said. She got up. She got to the doorway. Then, because she was not always the person she was trying to be, she stopped and said without turning around, Thank you for saying that. He didn't answer. She went to bed. She lay in the dark in the room that she had finally unpacked into, completely, not just the essentials, all the way to her two good books standing on the windowsill and the photograph of her mother's farm on the dresser. And she thought about Thomas Aldridge and his father, the farrier, and a man who had apparently asked the right questions and listened to the answers and filed them away quietly and not mentioned them until they were needed. She thought about Grant Holloway and his good teeth and his careful sympathy, and I always have room for capable people. She thought about the two women in the store and their whispering, and she thought, with a sharpness that surprised her, about how much she did not want to leave Iron Hollow Ranch. Not because she had nowhere else to go. She had managed nowhere else before, and she would manage it again. But because this particular place, this cold and functional and not beautiful house, had started to feel like something she hadn't had in a very long time. She could not yet name it precisely. Something in the vicinity of rest. Something in the shape of a place where she was allowed to be competent and difficult and tired and not penalized for any of it. She was not foolish enough to call it home yet. She had learned the hard way that calling something home before you were sure was just another way of giving someone else the power to take it from you. But she was aware, lying in the dark, listening to the Wyoming wind find all the gaps in the walls, that she was already protecting it in her mind the way you protect things that matter to you, already cataloging its particulars, already in some quiet way she hadn't authorized, belonging to it a little. That frightened her more than Holloway. More than the whispers, more than the cold, because the things you don't mean to want are always the ones that do the most damage when they go. Outside, December settled over Iron Hollow like it intended to stay. The snow came on a Saturday and did not stop until Monday, and by Tuesday morning the world outside the kitchen window was white and closed and very still, and Eliza Hartwell stood at the stove making coffee that would not burn this time, and listened to the sounds of the house around her, the particular creak of the floorboards in the hall that meant Silas was up, the sound of the barn door from somewhere far across the snow, and did not let herself think too carefully about what she felt. She just made the coffee and waited for the sounds of the house to find their morning rhythm, and told herself that was enough for now, and almost believed it. January came in harder than December had left off, which was saying something. The cold that settled over Iron Hollow in the first weeks of the new year was the kind that didn't announce itself dramatically. It just arrived and stayed, working its way into walls and floors and the spaces between your fingers with a patience that felt almost personal. Eliza had grown up with cold. She knew how to dress for it, how to move through it, how to keep a fire at exactly the temperature that would last without burning through the wood supply too fast. What she hadn't expected was the particular quality of a Wyoming winter that made even indoor spaces feel provisional, like the house was only temporarily keeping the outside at bay, and both parties knew it. She did not complain about it. That was not something she did. What she did was add a second log to the kitchen stove at 4 a.m. and start the coffee earlier and make sure the ledgers were done before the afternoon light failed, because the lamp oil, while no longer overpriced since she'd fixed the supplier situation, was still a resource that deserved respect. Small disciplines. The kind of thing you do when you've learned that comfort is not a given and preparation is the only argument you have against circumstances going wrong. Silas had noticed somewhere in December that she woke at 4. He hadn't said anything about it for almost 3 weeks. Then one morning she came down to find he had already added the second log and the coffee was on and not burning, and she understood that was his version of having a conversation about it. She had poured herself a cup and said, "You didn't have to do that." "I was up anyway," he said, which was not quite true, and they both knew it, and neither of them addressed that directly. The days had their rhythm now. She had stopped thinking of the ranch as someone else's place that she was visiting, and had started thinking of it as a system she was responsible for, which was different in a way that was hard to articulate, but that she felt clearly in how she moved through the mornings. There was a satisfaction in it that she hadn't expected, not the satisfaction of teaching, which had been about watching other people become more than they were, but a different kind. Quieter, more physical. The satisfaction of a well-kept ledger, of a pantry that made sense, of knowing without checking that the south pasture fence had been repaired and the winter feed calculation was correct and the horses had what they needed. She was good at this. She had not known she would be. What she was less good at was Silas himself. That was the honest assessment, and she was, by disposition, honest with herself even when it was inconvenient. She understood how he worked in the practical sense. She had learned his habits and his silences and the specific way he moved through the ranch that told you whether it had been a good morning or a difficult one. She understood his economy with words, which was not the same as having nothing to say. She had come to understand it was more like a man who had learned very precisely which words were necessary and which ones were just noise, and had removed the noise. She respected it. She also found it, at intervals, maddening, because there were things she wanted to know and could not ask, not gracefully, not without stepping into territory that neither of them had agreed to step into when the arrangement was made. Things like, who had the coat belonged to before her? Things like, what the locked room at the end of the upstairs hall was, and why Silas walked past it every morning without his eyes touching it. The specific avoidance of a man who has practiced not looking at something for a long time. Things like, what he meant, some evenings, when she caught him watching her with an expression she could not name, but that sat in her chest afterward in a way she did not entirely know what to do with. She did not ask. February brought the worst of the snow and something else along with it. The escalation of Grant Holloway. It had been building since November in the way that things build when someone is operating on a timeline you're not aware of. She had noticed the pattern in small pieces, the way she would hear something in town that tracked back, when she thought carefully, to something only Holloway could have said. A comment from Harold Pruitt, delivered in the tentative way of a man passing on information he wasn't sure he should be passing on, about a rumor circulating that the Iron Hollow arrangement was irregular. A mention from the wife of one of the neighboring smallholders that she had heard Silas Mercer's woman had come under strange circumstances. Something about a school. Eliza had a very specific response to this kind of thing, which was to become extremely still and extremely pleasant and extremely unrevealing. She had honed it over 11 years of being a woman in a professional role, surrounded by people who considered that combination inherently suspicious. She deployed it now every time she was in town, and it cost her more than she let show. The direct approach came on a Tuesday in February. Of course it was a Tuesday, when Holloway appeared at the ranch. She was in the yard when his wagon came through the gate, and she had about 15 seconds to decide how she wanted to handle the fact that Silas was in the far pasture and would not be back for at least an hour. She used the 15 seconds to pull her coat straight and put her hands in her pockets and wait. Holloway got down from the wagon with the practiced ease of a man who was comfortable arriving places uninvited. He was dressed well, as always. He had someone with him, a younger man, maybe 25, who stayed by the wagon and looked at his boots. "Miss Hartwell," Holloway said, like he was genuinely pleased. "I was hoping to catch Silas. He's not available. I can wait. That might be a while." He smiled. "Then I'll be brief, and you can pass it along." He looked around the yard with that evaluative gaze she had cataloged the first time she met him, the look of a man who is pricing things. Place is looking better kept than it was. That you're doing? It's a joint effort. Modest. He said it like a compliment. I came to talk about the eastern water access. There's been a question about the creek boundary since the thaw. Silas and I have different recollections of where the survey line falls. I'd like to resolve it before spring. She had read the land documents, all of them, in the course of getting the ranch records in order, because incomplete information was the thing she trusted least. She knew exactly where the eastern survey line fell, and she knew Silas's recollection of it was correct. I'll let him know you came by, she said. Holloway nodded, but he didn't move toward the wagon. While I'm here, and I say this with genuine respect, Miss Hartwell, I've been thinking about the position I mentioned, back in November. She said nothing. I run a larger operation than Iron Hollow, more resources, a proper household staff. I could offer you a formal contract with terms considerably more secure than, he paused, whatever the current arrangement is. The current arrangement. He had put something very particular into those 3 words, something that was meant to sound like concern and was actually something else entirely. The current arrangement, she said, is not something I need your opinion on. Of course not. Still pleasant, still smiling. I only mean that a woman of your abilities deserves a situation with clarity, with a defined role, with another pause. Certainty about her position. She looked at him for a moment. She had met his type before, though his type usually showed up in school board meetings rather than ranch yards. The type that wraps the knife in kindness and then wonders why you flinch when they get close. I know my position, Mr. Holloway, she said. Thank you for the visit. Something shifted behind his eyes. Brief, controlled, but she caught it. She had spent 11 years watching children's faces for the exact moment when patience ran out. Adults were not as different as they liked to think. I'll leave you to it then, he said pleasantly. Give Silas my regards. She watched the wagon until it was back through the gate. Then she went inside and stood at the kitchen table for a moment with her hands flat on the wood, breathing slowly. She told Silas about the visit that evening, all of it, the water access excuse, the job offer, the pointed use of the current arrangement. She said it plainly and without drama and watched his face while she said it. His expression did not change very much. This was, she had learned, not the same as not reacting. He was the kind of man whose reactions happened somewhere below the surface and only sent small signals upward, and you had to know where to look. He's been doing this for a while, he said. Different approaches. Same direction. The water boundary. He knows where the line falls, Silas said. It was settled. He was there when it was settled. Then what does he actually want? Silas looked at the table. My land is between his northern and southern operations. If he could consolidate, he'd have the largest spread in the county. He said it without particular emotion, like he was describing the weather. He's made offers before. I've said no. And now he's... what? Trying a different angle. He's trying several. She thought about whatever the current arrangement is. She thought about a woman of your abilities. She thought about the women in the general store and the word irregular. He's been spreading the rumors, she said. It wasn't a question. Silas looked up. I suspected. Why didn't you say something? What would I have said? Not defensively, a genuine question. I can't prove it, and saying it out loud wouldn't have stopped it. She sat with that for a moment. He wasn't wrong. She knew he wasn't wrong. She also knew there was something else in his answer, a man who had learned to absorb damage quietly because he had not seen another option, and who had possibly applied that same approach to things that deserved more than quiet absorption. She didn't push it, but she thought about it later. She thought about it quite a bit. March arrived, and with it a particular kind of tension that had less to do with Holloway and more to do with the daily closeness of a life shared in a not very large house between 2 people who were pretending, with increasing effort, that everything was straightforwardly professional. She knew by March that she was in trouble. She would not have called it what it was, not to herself, not then, but she knew she was in trouble in the specific way that you know a thing you are not ready to do anything about. She noticed where he was in the house without meaning to. She noticed the specific cadence of his footsteps in the hall and could tell from them whether he had been to the barn or the pasture or the supply shed. She noticed when he was tired in a way that was different from ordinary tired, and she noticed the particular set of his face when something on the property had gone wrong and he hadn't decided yet whether to mention it. She noticed him. That was the problem. With a specificity and attention that had no practical application and several potential consequences she preferred not to examine. She had been very careful in her life about this kind of thing. She had watched other women, smart women, capable women, get undone by the particular trap of caring about someone more than was safe, in a situation where the caring was not a negotiated thing and might not be returned. She had almost walked into that trap herself once, with the man who had said she was a lot to manage, and she had recognized it just barely in time and backed away from it with the specific wariness of someone who had gotten close to a ledge. She was aware she was close to a ledge again. She managed it the way she managed most things that threatened to get out of her control, which was by working. There was always more work at Iron Hollow. The accounts, the spring preparation, the inventory of what the winter had used up and what needed replenishing before the roads were easy again. She worked, and the work kept her busy. And busy was a form of safe. It was in March, on an afternoon when the snow had started to thin and she could see grass in small patches near the south fence, that she found the letter. She had been reorganizing the small desk in the room Silas used as a study, not going through his things precisely. He had asked her to find the original deed documents for the eastern boundary, and the desk was where documents of that kind lived, in a state of disorder that she had been meaning to address. She had been working methodically through the stacks of paper, setting aside what was clearly not the deed, when the envelope fell out from between two land assessment forms. It was not sealed. It looked like it had been read many times. The paper at the creases was soft with handling, gone almost transparent in places. Her name was not on it. Nothing was on the outside. She would not have read it, except that it fell open as it hit the desk and she saw the handwriting before she could decide not to. Silas, it began, in a woman's handwriting, careful and slightly formal, in the way of someone writing something they had thought about for a long time. I know you will keep this letter, and I know you will not know what to do with it, because that is the way you are with things that matter to you. You hold on, and you go quiet, and you wait for the moment to pass, and sometimes it passes, and sometimes it doesn't, and either way you never say the thing you should have said. Eliza's hands were very still on the desk. She knew she should put it down. She knew this the way you know a door you are about to open leads somewhere you are not ready to go. She put it down, and then she picked it up again, because she was imperfect and human, and the words were already in her eyes. I am not angry, the letter continued. I want you to understand that before anything else. I am not angry about the way you loved me. I know you loved me the only way you knew how, which was quietly, and from a certain distance, the way you stand at the edge of the far pasture and watch the horses rather than going in among them, because you are never entirely sure you have the right to take up that much space. I have tried for years to tell you that you have the right. I'm not sure I ever managed it in a way you could hear. But I need to say this, even if you read it after I'm gone and can't argue with me about it, the problem was never that you didn't love enough. The problem was that you kept the love inside like it was something that might break if you let it out. And the people who needed to know about it, I needed to know about it, out loud, with words sometimes. We were left guessing. And guessing is a lonely business, Silas. I don't know who comes after me. But whoever she is, please try. Please try to be less quiet about the things that matter. You have a capacity for love that I have never seen in another person, but it does no one any good if it stays folded up inside you like that spare coat in the back of the closet. Take it out. Use it. Let someone see it. I love you. I always have. Catherine. The letter ended there. Eliza sat with it in her hands for a long time. Outside, the late afternoon light was changing. That particular western light that went golden and then orange and then was gone fast, always faster than you expected. She could hear the distant sound of the barn, which meant Silas was back from the pasture. She put the letter back exactly where it had been, between the two land assessment forms, with the careful attention of someone returning something fragile to its case. Then she found the deed documents, which had been at the bottom of the second stack the whole time, and she put them on the corner of the desk, and she walked out of the study, and down the hall to the kitchen and stood at the window until her breathing was entirely under her control. She was trying to think clearly. She was good at thinking clearly. She had always been good at it. What the letter told her was this: Catherine Mercer, whoever she had been, whatever she had looked like, whatever her life with Silas had held, had known him well enough to put her finger precisely on the thing about him that was most difficult to live with. You kept the love inside like it was something that might break. She had written those words, and she had been right about them, and then she had died and left Silas alone with them, and with a house that had gone cold in a way that no amount of fire in the stove entirely fixed. Eliza understood all of that. She was not a foolish woman, and she was not inexperienced with grief, and she understood that a man who had lost someone he loved that way, slowly enough to have watched it happening, fast enough to have run out of time before he said what he meant, would come out of it changed in particular ways, quieter, more careful, more practiced at holding things inside where they were safe. She understood it. What she could not see clearly, what the letter had made suddenly, sharply unclear, was whether she was standing in this house and in this life because Silas Mercer had genuinely wanted her here, or because she was useful, because she had organized the pantry and fixed the accounts, and turned a cold, drifting operation into something functional again. Because she was, as Catherine had apparently tried to tell him, a person who could fill the practical shape of what was missing, even if what was inside the shape was never going to be acknowledged. We were left guessing, and guessing is a lonely business. She was guessing. She had been guessing since October. She had been telling herself the guessing was manageable, that uncertainty was not the same as absence, that a man who left a coat on the kitchen table and got up at 4 a.m. to put a log on the fire was communicating something even if he wasn't communicating it with words. But Catherine had guessed too, for years. And Catherine had known him far better than Eliza did. And Catherine had still found it lonely. She thought about the locked room at the end of the upstairs hall. She thought about the way Holloway had said whatever the current arrangement is, with that particular intonation that was designed to make her hear all the things it could mean. She thought about Gerald Fitch's letter in 2 paragraphs on county letterhead and the specific feeling of having your entire life reduced to something a stranger could dismiss without looking up from his desk. She pressed her fingernails into her palm. She had made a promise to herself after Millfield, after the fire and Fitch and the 3 weeks in the boarding house with the biscuits and the 2 shawls. She had promised herself, not out loud, not to anyone who could hold her to it, but in the same serious way she made all her real promises, that she would not, again, let herself be in a position where someone else decided what her future looked like. That the next time she was in danger of that happening, she would move first. She would choose first. She had broken most of that promise already, she realized. Somewhere between October and March, she had stopped choosing and started waiting. And waiting for Silas Mercer to tell her what he meant was likely to be a wait of indefinite length that ended in the same quiet loneliness Catherine had described. She made herself eat dinner. She made herself sit at the table and talk about the deed documents and the eastern boundary question, and she managed it well enough that Silas gave no indication he noticed anything different. He was not always good at noticing things that were not in front of him, and she was good at not showing what she wasn't ready to show. She went to bed at 9 and did not sleep until well after midnight. She lay in the dark and listened to the house and thought about Catherine's letter. Not the specific words, she had already said the specific words to herself until they had worn grooves, but the shape of the thing it told her. She thought about a man who had kept love folded up inside him like a spare coat, and a woman who had spent years guessing, and the way that loneliness outlasted even people who loved each other. She thought about herself, which was not something she made a habit of, not honestly, not in the way that required looking at things she would have preferred to leave in the peripheral. She thought, you came here with nothing, and this place gave you something, and now you are in danger of needing it in a way that gives it power over you. And the thing about power is that the person who holds it doesn't have to mean any harm in order to do it. Silas Mercer was not Gerald Fitch. He was not Grant Holloway. He was not the man who had called her a lot to manage. He was, as far as she could determine, a decent and honest man who had lost someone and had gone quiet afterward in a way that might be permanent. But decent and honest and loving someone quietly from a distance were not, Catherine had apparently found, enough to build a life on. Not for the person doing the guessing. The decision came in the way her real decisions always came. Not dramatically, not in a single clear moment, but as the result of a long, honest conversation with herself that she had been avoiding for weeks, and could no longer avoid. It came quietly, the way necessary things sometimes do, in the particular dark hours when there was nothing left to distract her from it. She would leave. Not because she hated this place, she didn't, and that was precisely the problem. Not because Silas had done anything wrong, he hadn't, and that was also precisely the problem. But because she had made a promise to herself about choosing first, and because Catherine's letter had made very clear what the alternative looked like, and because she was 34 years old and she had survived a fire and a school board and 3 weeks of biscuits and managed ranch accounts and fixed a supplier overcharge that had been bleeding money for 18 months, and she was not going to spend the next several years of her life guessing. She would go in the morning, before breakfast, before she could think herself out of it, before the ordinary machinery of the day made the decision feel dramatic when it wasn't. She would pack what was hers, which wasn't much. It fit in the bag she had arrived with, and she would leave a note that said the accounts were in order and where the spring supplier contracts were filed, and she would walk to Clearwater and figure out the rest from there. She pressed her fingernails into her palm one final time and then made herself stop. She got up and pulled her bag from the bottom of the wardrobe and began to pack. She packed slowly and with great care, the way she did most things, folding each item properly rather than just pushing it in. The 2 good books, the photograph of her mother's farm, the spare teaching certificate she had never used, the pencils she still carried out of habit, the brown wool coat. She paused on that. She put it in. She would sort out the ethics of that later. She was cold and she had earned something in this place, even if it wasn't the thing she had wanted. She worked until the bag was full, and then she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, coat already on, bag at her feet, and waited for enough light to see the road. Outside, something was changing in the quality of the dark. The particular graying that comes before dawn when the world starts deciding what shape it intends to be today. She could see the outline of the window. She could see the 2 books she had put on the windowsill months ago, which she had just taken back down. She picked up her bag. She walked down the hall. She walked through the kitchen, where the coffee things were laid out on the counter because she had put them there herself last night out of habit, and she did not let herself think about that. She went out through the front and stood on the porch with her bag. The air was the kind of cold that hits your face like a statement of fact. The sky in the east had the very first suggestion of light, gray, and tentative. The ranch spread around her in the pre-dawn dark, fence lines and outbuildings and the distant shape of the barn, and it looked in this light like a place that had been here a long time and intended to keep being here, regardless of who was in it. She stood on the porch. She held the bag. She had made a promise to herself. She was going to keep it. What she had not calculated, had not been able to calculate, lying in the dark doing her honest inventory, was the sound of the front door opening behind her. She did not turn around immediately. That was the honest account of it. She heard the door and she stood very still on the porch, with her bag in her hand and the first gray light of morning coming up over the eastern fence line, and she did not turn around, because turning around required a kind of readiness she was not sure she had, and because some part of her, the part that had been pressing fingernails into palms for 34 years to keep from feeling too much in front of people, needed one more second to get its footing. Eliza. He had never called her that before, not once in 5 months. It had always been Miss Hartwell, delivered with that particular economy of his, the 2 words carrying everything he intended to convey and nothing extra. She had not realized until this moment that she had been keeping track of that, had been noting each time the slight formal distance of it, or that hearing her given name in his voice would land the way it did. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway in his work clothes, which meant he had been up for a while, or had not slept, and either way it told her something she wasn't sure she was ready to know. His hat was not on. She had almost never seen him in the house without his hat. He looked, in the gray pre-dawn light, like a man who had arrived at a place he had been trying to avoid for some time and had run out of room to keep avoiding it. "Going somewhere?" he said. It was not a challenge. It was not an accusation. It was just the question, said the way he said most things, plainly, without strategic coloring, and that plainness was, at this particular moment, the most difficult thing she could have been offered. "Yes," she said. He stepped out onto the porch. Not close. He left the distance between them that she had come to recognize as his version of giving a person room. The way he entered the pasture carefully rather than moving through the horses fast. He looked at the bag in her hand and then he looked at her face. "Because of the letter," he said. She went very still. "You knew I found it." "I saw the desk." A pause. "I should have moved it. I've thought about moving it a dozen times." He looked out at the property rather than at her the way he did when he was working toward something difficult. "I kept not doing it." "Why?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Because moving it felt like admitting she was gone, and some mornings that was still—" He stopped, started again. "Some mornings that was still the thing I couldn't do before the day started." She held the bag. She did not move. She was aware of the cold on her face and the way the sky was lightening in slow increments in the east, and the fact that she had made a decision in the dark last night, and she was not certain it had survived this conversation intact. "I'm not leaving because of grief," she said carefully. "I understand grief. I'm not— That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" She looked at him for a moment. "Did you read the letter?" "I wrote the letter," he said. "She dictated it to me when she couldn't hold the pen anymore. I wrote every word she said, in her handwriting as best I could manage it." He paused. "It took us 2 hours. She kept stopping to correct me when I didn't get her phrasing right." Something hit Eliza in the chest that she had no word ready for. She had imagined Catherine Mercer writing that letter alone, privately, with the specific solitude of a woman putting down things her husband might not hear until she was beyond having to watch him receive them. She had not imagined Silas sitting beside her writing it himself, word by word, in an imitation of his wife's handwriting so that it would feel like her voice when he read it later. She could not speak for a moment. "She was right," he said, "about all of it. I want you to know I know that." He was still looking at the fence line. "She was right that I kept things too far inside, that the people who needed to hear what I meant had to guess instead, and that guessing is—" He repeated Catherine's word back without appearing to realize he was doing it. "Lonely. She was right about that." "Silas, let me finish." He said it quietly, but with a firmness that stopped her. "I've been doing the same thing with you. I know that. I've known it for a while. I told myself it was appropriate, given the arrangement, given that you'd made no indication of—" He stopped, rerouted. "I told myself a lot of things. Most of them were management, ways of keeping what I actually meant at a distance where it was safer." The sky was getting lighter. She could see the grass now near the south fence, the thin, early green of it coming up through what was left of the snow. She had a bag in her hand, and she had been on her way to Clearwater, and her legs had not moved in several minutes. "The room," he said. She waited. "I told you I had a spare room." He turned to look at her now, and she saw in his face the expression she had catalogued all winter without being able to name, the expression that sat in her chest afterward. That wasn't true. She heard it. She wasn't sure she understood it yet. "What do you mean it wasn't true?" "There is no spare room at Iron Hollow. There never was. This house has 3 rooms, the main room, the study, and the one at the end of the hall." He paused. "The room I put you in was mine, has been mine for 12 years. She said nothing. She was doing the thing she did when information arrived that was going to require a full rearrangement of what she thought she knew, taking it in carefully, not reacting until she had turned it over completely. "I moved my things the afternoon I got your second letter," he said, "the one that said you accepted. I took everything I needed to the room at the end of the hall, and I put the quilt on the bed and I left the candle on the dresser." A pause. "The south-facing room gets the best light in the morning. I didn't want you to wake up in a dark room on the first day and think—" He stopped. "Think what?" she said. "Think you'd made a mistake coming." She pressed her fingernails into her palm. She had never needed the habit more than she needed it right now. "You gave me your room," she said. Not a question, working it out. "I didn't want you to feel like a guest in a corner, or like you were there on someone else's terms." He looked down at his hands, then back at the fence line. "I thought if you had the best room, if it was actually comfortable, if the light was right, you might feel less like you could be asked to leave." "Why would I be asked to leave?" "You wouldn't be. I wouldn't—" He stopped. "That's not what I meant. I meant I wanted you to feel that." He was struggling with it, and she could see him struggling, and she understood. from Catherine's letter and from 5 months of watching him, exactly what this effort was costing him. He was a man who had spent years practicing how not to say the essential thing, and he was dismantling that practice in real time, in the cold, on a porch, talking to a woman who was holding a packed bag. "I've been watching you since October," he said. "I want you to know that. You, not the way. I don't mean it in a way that should make you uncomfortable. I mean, I have been watching what you do here, how you think, the way you looked at the supply shed like it was a problem you had already solved in your head before you started moving anything, the way you ate that cold biscuit on the first morning without complaining, the way you talked to Harold Pruitt about the fabric when those women were saying things in the corner, and you kept your face perfectly composed and your voice completely normal, and I could tell, by the way your hand was in your coat pocket, that you were—" He paused. "Managing." She remembered the coat pocket. She had been pressing her fingernails into her palm inside it. "The night Thomas Aldridge's father came to reshoe the horses," Silas continued, "he told me what happened in that schoolhouse. All of it. The first time you went back in, and the second time, and the boy under the desk. And I sat in the barn after he left, and I thought about you reading Fitch's letter, about what it costs a person to do the right thing and then have the wrong story told about it." He looked at her directly. "I thought about it for a long time. You didn't say anything. I didn't know how to say it in a way that didn't sound like—" He searched for the word. "Pity. And you're not a woman who wants pity. I could see that from the first morning." "What did I want?" she asked. She didn't mean it as a challenge. She was genuinely asking, curious, in the particular sharp way of wanting to know how she had appeared to someone who had been watching honestly. "To be taken at face value," he said. "To have what you did be the thing that mattered, not the story someone told about why you did it." He paused. "That's not complicated. That's just," he said it simply, "basic decency. And you hadn't been getting it." She looked at the fence line because she couldn't look at him. "The accounts," he said, "the supplier, the feed calculation, the way you sorted the pantry so that even I could find the salt without thinking about it. Every morning this winter I have walked into a house that works, Eliza, because of what you built into it. And I have said—" He stopped. "I have not said enough. I know that. I have told myself you could see it, that a woman who was as observant as you clearly are would see what I wasn't saying and understand it." "Catherine told you that didn't work?" Eliza said quietly. "Yes," he said. "She did." A long pause. "And I told myself you were different, that you were more—" He stopped himself. "That's not fair to her, and it's not honest. The truth is I told myself that because it was easier than doing this." He gestured at the space between them, the porch, the morning, the conversation itself. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want you to know that going in. I have never been good at it, and Catherine spent years trying to make me better at it, and I improved some, but not enough, and she would be the first to tell you that. I am better at fixing fence than I am at saying what I mean to people who matter to me." He looked at the bag in her hand. "But you are standing on a porch at dawn with a packed bag because I let it go too long again, and I am not willing to do that twice." The light in the east had shifted, from gray to the particular pale gold that meant the sun was close but not yet visible. She could see the whole yard now. She could see the barn and the near pasture, and the place in the south fence where Silas had spent 3 hours in November repairing a break in the boards, and had done it so well you couldn't see where the break had been. "What are you saying?" she said. "Exactly, not around it." He took a breath. "I'm saying Iron Hollow is not a different place than it was 6 months ago. The land is the same, the work is the same, the problems are the same." He paused. "But the house is different. You are the reason it's different, not the pantry, not the accounts. You. The way you come down at 4 in the morning and you don't pretend you weren't already awake. The way you push back when I'm wrong about something and you're not apologetic about it. The way some people are when they think the other person might not like hearing it. The way you sat in the kitchen that night in December and told me that people believe what makes a better story, and I could hear that you'd had to learn that the hard way, and I—" He stopped. "I wanted very badly," he said, "to be someone who made you unlearn it. She had pressed her fingernails so deep into her palm that they would leave marks. She was aware of this, and she did not stop. "You read Catherine's letter," he said, "and you thought it told you that I'm not capable of claiming the people I—" He didn't finish that. He moved past it. "You thought it told you something permanent about me, about what I can offer. Didn't it? It told you what I was," he said. "When she wrote it, or when she told me to write it." He looked at her steadily. "People change, Eliza. Not fast, not cleanly, not as much as you might want them to, but I have been," he searched, "trying since October. Trying to be different from what that letter described. And I haven't told you I was trying because you didn't know how. Because I was afraid," he said. "That's the honest answer. I was afraid that if I said what I meant, you would tell me the arrangement wasn't what you'd signed up for, and you would go. And if I didn't say it, you might go anyway, but at least I hadn't made it happen by—" He stopped. "By asking for something and being refused." She looked at him. She looked at the bag in her hand. "You gave me your room," she said again, "on the first night, so I wouldn't feel trapped." "Yes." "And you got up at 4 a.m. and put logs on the fire." "Yes." "And you bought the coat without saying anything about it." "You needed a coat." "Silas." She said his name the way he had said hers, with a weight she hadn't planned. "Those are not the actions of a man who is keeping someone at arm's length." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't suppose they are. They're the actions of a man who cares what happens to a person, who has been—" She found Catherine's word, "trying." "I should have said it plainly sooner," he said. "I know that." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He held her gaze. "I'm saying it now." The sun came up then, not dramatically, not in any way that felt staged, just the ordinary arrival of morning light over an ordinary Wyoming ranch that had been cold and was beginning to warm. It came over the eastern fence line in a flat, clear way that lit the yard without sentimentality and showed everything exactly as it was. The mud near the barn door, the patched south fence, the thin early grass, a man on a porch who had just said the hardest true thing he knew how to say. She looked down at the bag in her hand. She thought about Gerald Fitch's letter, 2 paragraphs. She thought about the boarding house room, and the biscuits, and the mending work, and the woman who looked at her with pity. She thought about the train and the platform, and arriving in a gray October to a wagon driven by a quiet stranger who had taken off his hat without performing it. She thought about a room with a south-facing window, and a candle that hadn't been lit yet, and a quilt, and a door that closed with a click so soft she barely heard it. She thought about Catherine's words. "Please try. Please try to be less quiet about the things that matter." And she thought that whatever this man was, imperfect, slower with words than he was with fence wire, more comfortable with action than declaration, still visibly carrying a grief that had changed the shape of him. He had heard those words. She could see it in the particular difficulty of this morning. He had heard them, and he was, at significant personal cost, trying. "You should have told me about the room," she said, "the first night, or any of the nights after." "Yes," he said. "It would have changed things." "I know. Not everything, but things." He said nothing, which was its own acknowledgement. "And the gossip in town," she said. "Holloway. You've known for months that he's been behind it." "I've suspected, yes." "You should have told me that too." "Yes." "I am not someone who needs protecting from bad news, Silas. I am someone who needs the bad news so I can do something useful with it." "I know that now." "You've known it longer than now." "Yes," he said. "I have." She shifted the bag in her hand. Not to go, just to shift it. Her arm was tired. "If I put this down," she said carefully, "it means I'm staying. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I want that to be clear. I have managed nowhere else before, and I'll manage it again if that's what's in front of me." She looked at him. "If I put it down, it's because I'm choosing to. Because you finally said the thing you should have said, and because I believe you meant it, and because—" She stopped. "Because why?" he said. She pressed her fingernails into her palm one final time and then made herself stop, made herself breathe, made herself say the honest thing because she was asking it of him and she could not ask it of him without being willing to do it herself. Because this house, she said, is the first place in a long time where I haven't felt like I was taking up too much space. And I know that's not nothing, even if it's been, she found the word, quiet, even if I've been guessing. You won't be guessing anymore, he said. She looked at his face. She looked at the yard. She looked at the south fence with its invisible repair and the barn and the thin grass and the flat morning light on all of it. She set the bag down. Not inside. She left it on the porch because she was not entirely without stubbornness, and she wanted him to understand it had been a real decision, not an easy one. She left it there, and she looked at him, and she said, "Make the coffee, then." Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but was the closest she had seen to one. "You don't trust me with the coffee." "I trust you with a great deal," she said. "The coffee is a specific exception." He held the door open, and she went inside, and the cold came in with her and dissipated in the warmth that the kitchen stove had been holding all night against the March morning. And she went to the stove and began making the coffee. And he stood at the kitchen table and didn't pretend he wasn't watching, and for the first time in 5 months, neither of them pretended the watching wasn't what it was. Later, after the coffee, after the morning had gotten fully underway, after Silas had gone out to the barn and come back, and they had worked through the morning's tasks with the particular altered quality of people who have said true things to each other and not yet fully adjusted to the changed atmosphere. He stopped in the kitchen doorway on his way back out and said, "I'll move back to my room if you want." She was at the ledger. She did not look up immediately. "The south-facing room?" "Yes." "With the best light?" "Yes." She turned a page in the ledger. "Stay where you are," she said. "I've gotten used to the light." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. She heard him go out. She sat with the ledger open in front of her and did not turn a page for a full minute. Just sat there with the morning light coming through the south-facing window the way it had come through every morning since October, the way she had taken for granted after a while because good things, when they are consistent, have a way of becoming ordinary before you have fully appreciated them. She thought about the bag still sitting on the porch. She went and got it and brought it inside and set it at the bottom of the wardrobe where it belonged. And she unpacked the 2 books and put them back on the windowsill, and the photograph of her mother's farm on the dresser, and the pencils on the small table by the bed, and she stood in the room for a moment and looked at all of it. Her things, arranged in a room that had been given to her on the first night so she would not feel trapped. And she breathed. Outside, Iron Hollow went about the business of late March morning. The horses in the near pasture. The wind along the fence lines. Silas somewhere in the south field, moving through the property with that focused economy that was his natural language, doing the work of the place the way he had done it for years, with this difference now, that he was not doing it alone, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. She went back to the ledger. She had been wrong about one thing, she thought, turning the page to where she had left off. She had read Catherine's letter and concluded that Silas was incapable of claiming the people he loved, that the silence was fixed in him, structural, a wall rather than a door. Catherine had not said that. Catherine had said, "Please try." She had written it as a hope, not an epitaph. She had left it for him to find because she believed the trying was possible. She had been right. Eliza had simply misread the letter, in the dark, in the early hours of a March morning when she had been afraid and tired and had run out of room to keep waiting. She was familiar with the experience of misreading something important and then having to revise. She had spent 11 years correcting children's comprehension errors without making them feel small about it. She applied the same courtesy to herself now. Noted the error, corrected it, moved on. Turned the page. Started the next column. The accounts were in good order. Spring was coming. The supplier contracts were filed where she had put them, in the 3rd drawer of the desk where anyone could find them, and the ledger was current to within 3 days, and the south-facing window was throwing good light across the page. She worked until noon without stopping, and the morning was ordinary in every way that counted, and she did not press her fingernails into her palm once. The week after the porch morning, as Eliza had started thinking of it, was not easier than the weeks before it. That was the thing nobody told you about honesty between 2 people. That saying the true thing didn't resolve the situation so much as it changed the terrain of it. The silence between them was different now, less like a wall and more like a room neither of them had fully furnished yet, and they moved around in it carefully, the way you move in a space where you're not entirely sure where things are going to land. Silas was trying. She could see the effort of it in small, specific ways. At breakfast, he said more than was strictly necessary. Not speeches, nothing that dramatic. Just an extra sentence where before there would have been none. A comment about the condition of the south fence. A question about whether she thought the spring supplier order needed adjusting. Small extensions of the ordinary into something that at least gestured toward conversation. She received each one without making it remarkable, because she understood that the worst thing she could do was treat his efforts like performances to be evaluated. She just answered and moved on and let the breakfast be what it was. It was imperfect. There were mornings where the old habits won and they sat in silence over their coffee, and neither of them bridged it. There were evenings where she could see him working towards something and not arriving, and she made herself not fill the gap for him, because that would only teach him that she would always do the work of connection for both of them, and she had made that mistake before in other situations, and she was not making it again. She said this to him on a Thursday in early April, plainly, because she had decided that plainness was going to have to be her contribution to whatever this was. "I'm not going to always reach across," she said. They were at the kitchen table after supper. "I want you to know that, not because I don't want to, but because if I do it every time, we end up back where we were." He looked at her. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, which was what he did when he was processing something he hadn't seen coming. "That's fair," he said. "It's not about fair, it's about what works." "All right." He set the cup down. "What does work?" "I don't know yet," she said. "We're figuring it out." He nodded slowly. "I can do that." "I know you can." She picked up her mending. "I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't think so." That was as close to a declaration as she was capable of at this stage, and they both understood it, and they left it there, and it was enough for the moment. What was not enough? What had been quietly accumulating toward a confrontation that Eliza had been half anticipating since February was Grant Holloway. The Eastern Water Boundary meeting happened on the second Saturday in April, in the yard at Iron Hollow, because Silas had insisted on his own ground and Holloway had agreed with the smoothness of a man who had already decided the location didn't matter. He arrived with two men she didn't recognize. Not ranch hands, they were dressed too carefully for that, and a county surveyor's document that he set on the yard table with the manner of someone laying down a winning card. Eliza was there. She had said she would be there, and Silas had not argued about it, which was progress of a specific kind. Holloway looked at her when he arrived and said, "Miss Hartwell," with the pleasant cordiality that she had long since identified as his default camouflage, and she said, "Mr. Holloway," with the particular composure that she had built over 11 years of managing rooms full of people who were testing her limits. The surveyor's document was, as she had expected, a problem. She had read the original land survey, all 47 pages of it, in the course of getting the ranch records into order. And she knew the Eastern Creek boundary the way she knew the supply ledger, precisely, without needing to look it up. What Holloway was presenting now was a document dated 3 years prior, allegedly from the county surveyor's office, that placed the boundary line 14 feet further west than the original survey. Silas was looking at it with the expression she had learned meant he was seeing a problem but hadn't yet found all the edges of it. "This was filed with the county," Holloway said, "after the boundary dispute. Silas, you were there. You agreed to the resurvey." "I agreed to a resurvey," Silas said. "I didn't agree to this line." "This is what the resurvey produced." Eliza said, "May I see it?" Holloway turned to her with a slightly adjusted version of his pleasant expression. "Of course." She took the document and read it with the focused attention she had given to the land records in January. She read it the way you read something when you already know what you are looking for. It took her approximately 90 seconds. "This document references a survey conducted by the county office in March of 1882, she said. "But it's signed by the county recorder, not the surveyor, and the marker references in Section 4, she pointed to the relevant paragraph, describe a cottonwood tree at the eastern bank as the fixed point. The original survey from 1871 describes the same tree." She set the document on the table. "That tree washed out in the 1879 flood. There is a stump where it was. I've seen it." A brief silence. If the fixed point is gone, she said, this document is measuring from a ghost. Whatever line it draws is from a reference that no longer exists, which means it has no legal standing against the 1871 original. One of Holloway's carefully dressed men looked at the other. Holloway himself was doing an admirable job of keeping his expression level. The county recorder filed this as valid. The county recorder is not a surveyor, she said, and I think you know that, Mr. Holloway, which is why this document came to a Saturday yard meeting rather than a courthouse. The pleasantness in Holloway's face shifted by a degree that most people would not have caught. She caught it. She had been watching for it since February. You're a careful reader, he said. Not a compliment, not anymore. I taught school for 11 years, she said. Reading carefully is a professional habit. Silas said, I think we're done here. Holloway looked at him. Something was being measured and calculated behind those good teeth and that well-dressed patience. This isn't over, he said. The county can be presented with the 1871 original and the evidence about the cottonwood, Eliza said. We'll file it Monday. Holloway picked up his document. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the pleasantness, not the calculated sympathy, not the subtle suggestion that she was in a precarious position and he was offering rescue. Just a straight, direct assessment, the face underneath the performance. You've made yourself useful here, he said. It was the most honest thing he had said to her in 5 months. Yes, she said. I have. He left. His 2 men followed. The wagon went back through the gate and down the road toward the Crescent Bell, and Eliza stood in the yard and watched until it was out of sight. Silas was quiet for a moment beside her. Then he said, The cottonwood. It's been a stump since 1879. I noticed it when I was walking the eastern boundary in February trying to understand the property map. You were walking the eastern boundary in February. It was a cold February. The walking helped. He made the sound she had come to recognize as his version of a laugh. You've known about that document being wrong since February. I've known the stump was there since February. I didn't know he had a document until today. She paused. I had suspicions. And you didn't say anything. I didn't want to alarm you about something that might not materialize. He looked at her sidelong. I thought we were done with that approach. She opened her mouth and closed it. He was right. That was the thing about calling out a habit in someone else. It had a way of turning around and looking at you. She had told him she needed him to reach across instead of waiting, and here she had been sitting on information since February because she had decided unilaterally that he didn't need to have it yet. That's fair, she said, using his words back at him. It's not about fair, he said with the precise inflection she had used 2 nights ago. It's about what works. She looked at him. He was still looking at the gate where Holloway's wagon had gone. You were paying attention, she said. I've been paying attention since October, he said. I was just doing it quietly. They filed the documents Monday morning, in person, at the county seat. It took most of the day and involved a county official named Patterson, who had clearly been hoping for a quieter week and found himself sitting across from Eliza Hartwell and a land survey from 1871 and a very specific argument about a cottonwood tree that no longer existed. Patterson listened to her lay out the case with the resigned expression of a man who recognized competence when it was aimed at him and had no reasonable counter to it. The Holloway boundary document was suspended pending review. Patterson said it would take several weeks. Eliza said she understood and thanked him and walked out of the county office into the April afternoon feeling something she had not felt in a very long time. Not relief, exactly. Relief was what you felt when a bad thing didn't happen. This was different, more forward-facing, more like the particular satisfaction of a woman who had walked into a room where the game was rigged and had found, in the careful reading of the fine print, the specific flaw that unrigged it. Silas was waiting by the wagon. He had let her do the talking in there, which had been the correct instinct, and she had noted it. Well, he said, suspended pending review. We'll get a decision in a few weeks. She climbed up to the bench. He's not done, Holloway. He'll find another angle. I know. But the land is safe for now. Yes. He picked up the reins. Thank you. She looked straight ahead. You don't have to thank me. This is my home too." He was quiet for a moment. Then, without looking at her, "Yes, it is." They drove back to Iron Hollow in the particular silence that is not an absence of communication, but a very full one, and she watched the landscape move past and felt the word she had just used, home, settle into her chest with the weight of something that had been true for a while and was only now being said out loud. The gossip in town did not stop immediately. That was not how gossip worked, and Eliza was too realistic to expect it. What changed gradually was its trajectory. When the news circulated, as news does in small towns, through the specific efficiency of people who pay close attention to each other's business, that the Iron Hollow woman had shown up at the county seat with an 1871 land survey and dismantled a document that Grant Holloway had apparently been cultivating for 3 years, the nature of the conversation shifted. Not entirely. Not everyone. But Harold Pruitt's handshake became warmer. The farrier's wife stopped looking through her when they passed on the street. A woman named Berta Crane, who ran the millinery and had been among the more active participants in the original Whisper campaign, stopped Eliza outside the general store on a Thursday in late April and said, with the stiff directness of someone who had thought about how to do this and decided just to do it, "I was told some things about you that I repeated without checking. I'm sorry for that." Eliza looked at her. Berta Crane was 60 or thereabouts, with a face that had been lived in considerably, and she was clearly not enjoying this speech but was making it anyway. "I appreciate that," Eliza said. "I don't know if you want to—" Berta stopped, started again. "I was hasty. About the fire. About what kind of woman would come to a ranch without a proper—" She stopped again. "I was wrong. You were given wrong information by someone who wanted a particular story to circulate," Eliza said. "That happens. The question is what you do when the story turns out to be wrong." Berta looked at her steadily. "That's a more generous response than I'd have given in your position. I've spent a lot of years in positions where I needed people to revise their conclusions about me," Eliza said. "I know what it takes to do it. I try not to make it harder than it is." They were not friends after that conversation, but they were not adversaries either, and in a small town the distance between those two things is worth managing carefully. Holloway made one more approach. She had expected it, and she had told Silas she expected it, and so when the letter arrived in early May, addressed to Silas, not to her, which was its own kind of message, neither of them was unprepared. It was a formal offer for the Iron Hollow land. A buying price that was generous enough to be insulting, in the way that generous offers sometimes are when the person making them believes you are in a weak position and wants to make sure you understand they know it. The letter was cordial. Of course it was cordial. Silas read it at the kitchen table and set it down and looked at her. "What do you think?" She thought it was the right question to ask her. She noted that he asked it without ceremony, like it was natural, like her opinion on the future of this property was not something that required justification. "I think he's testing whether the county setback rattled us," she said. "I think he's offering money because the boundary approach failed, and he wants to see if we're tired." "Are we tired?" She looked at him. "Are you?" He picked up the letter and folded it and set it aside. "No," he said. "Then write him back and say so." He wrote 3 sentences. She did not ask to read them, but he left the letter on the table when he went to post it, and she read it anyway, because she was practical, and she liked knowing what was in the correspondence relating to her home. "Mr. Holloway, Iron Hollow is not for sale at any price. Please do not write again on this subject. Silas Mercer." She put the letter back where it was. She went back to the accounts. That evening, she moved the photograph of her mother's farm from the dresser to the kitchen windowsill, where it would get more light. She did this without deliberate ceremony. She was reorganizing the dresser to make room for a few things she had bought in town, and it was only after she had set it on the sill and stepped back that she understood what she had done. Her mother's farm. In the kitchen window of another house, placed where it would be seen every morning while the coffee was being made. She left it there. May came in gently after a rough April, which was Wyoming's version of an apology. The grass in the south pasture came up thick, and the creek ran clear with snowmelt, and there were days when the light in the mornings was the kind that made even ordinary things look like they were worth looking at. She spent a Saturday afternoon repairing the chicken wire on the small outbuilding she had converted into a proper feed storage in January, using a technique she had figured out by herself that was probably not the correct technique but was effective. Silas came by and watched for a moment and said nothing about the technique, which she appreciated. "I'm going to plant a kitchen garden," she said without looking up from the wire. "On the south side of the house. Ground's still hard." "I know. I'll start it in a few weeks. I just wanted to tell you." He was quiet for a moment. "What will you put in it?" "Practical things first. Potatoes, onions, maybe carrots." She pulled the wire taut. "And one thing that's not practical." "What's that?" "Lavender," she said. "My mother grew it on the east side of her farmhouse, and I have always wanted to grow it, and it's not useful for anything much, and I don't particularly care." She heard something in his silence that was different from his usual silences. She looked up. He was looking at the south side of the house with an expression she had catalogued and could now read more accurately, the expression that sat in her chest. "Plant it where you want," he said. "It's your garden. It's your land." "Same thing," he said, simply, like it was already obvious. And then he walked back toward the barn before she could figure out how to receive what he had just said, which she suspected was entirely intentional, because he was learning, slowly, the particular art of saying the meaningful thing and then giving the other person room to sit with it without having to respond immediately. She turned back to the chicken wire. She held the wire correctly and did not press her fingernails into her palm. The formal question of their arrangement, what it was going to be, arrived in its own time, which was a June evening when the light lasted until almost 9, and the kitchen was warm with the smell of supper still in it, and they were both at the table not quite doing anything, which had become a thing they did in the evenings, sitting in the same space without agenda. He had been working towards something for about 20 minutes. She could tell by the way he turned his coffee cup. She had learned to recognize it, and she had learned to wait for it, because hurrying him toward the hard thing was not something that worked, and she had stopped trying. "I've been thinking about what this is," he said finally. She waited. "The arrangement." He said the word with a slight emphasis that made it clear he was using it deliberately as a category he was about to argue against. "What we called it at the start." "What did we call it?" she said, not challenging, wanting to know how he had filed it. "A household position, a formal arrangement." He looked at his cup. "Those were the words." "Yes." "They're not right anymore." She said nothing. She let him continue at his own pace. "I don't know how to say this well," he said. "I want you to know I know that. I have been thinking about how to say it well for about 3 weeks, and I haven't gotten there. So I'm going to say it the way I can, and you'll have to—" He stopped. "You'll have to tell me if I've gotten it badly wrong." "All right." He looked at her directly. "I would like this to be permanent, Eliza. I would like you to be here, not in the arrangement, not as a position, as—" He searched, and she saw him decide to use the plainest word available rather than reach for a better one that wouldn't come, "as my wife, if that's something you'd be willing to consider." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the June evening was doing what June evenings in Wyoming did, going golden and slow in a way that made time feel slightly suspended. She thought, in the silence, about the woman who had sat in a boarding house room in October with $12 and a tin box and a terminated contract and an envelope she was about to address to a stranger in Wyoming. She thought about what that woman had been hoping for when she wrote the letter. Not this. She had not let herself hope for this. She had hoped for useful work in a room with a door that closed and the bare minimum of dignity. She had been a careful hoper, calibrated to what she thought was realistic. She thought about imperfect things, about a man who wrote letters in his dying wife's handwriting and kept them in a desk drawer because moving them felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit, about someone who gave away his bedroom on the first night and got up at 4 in the morning and left a coat on the table and learned, slowly and at significant personal cost, to say the thing he meant instead of keeping it folded up inside where it was safe but useless, about herself. About a woman who had organized a pantry and fixed a supplier overcharge and dismantled a fraudulent boundary document and was planning to grow lavender on the south side of a house because she wanted to, because it was not useful for anything much, and she did not particularly care. About a woman who had carried her mother's photograph from a boarding house to a train to a ranch in Wyoming and put it in a kitchen window where the morning light could reach it. About what it meant to stay somewhere, not because you had nowhere else to go, but because you had decided. "You should know," she said, "that I am not easy to live with. I reorganize things that don't need reorganizing, and I have opinions about everything, and I will tell you when I think you're wrong, and I don't always soften it the way I probably should." "I know," he said, "and I'm not going to guess anymore about what you mean. I'm going to ask, and you're going to have to answer, and if you go quiet for too long, I'm going to say something about it. I know that too. And I'm going to plant the lavender, and it's going to not be useful, and you're going to have to make peace with that." Something happened in his face that was fully a smile this time. Arrived and stayed. She had not seen it stay before. "I already have," he said. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She thought about the porch in March, and the bag she had set down, and then gone back to retrieve from inside the house. Not symbolically, practically, because it was a cold morning and she was pragmatic. And she thought about what it meant that she had brought the bag inside and unpacked it again, all the way, books on the windowsill and everything. "Yes," she said. "I'll consider it very seriously and I'll get back to you." He looked at her. "That's not—" "Yes," she said again. "I mean, yes. The other was a joke. I'm capable of humor occasionally." He made the sound that was his laugh, short, dry, but this time it continued for an extra beat, and that extra beat was new, and she decided quietly that she was going to work on earning more of them. They married in July. Small, plain, at the county office with Harold Pruitt and his wife as witnesses, which had been Eliza's suggestion because she had no family traveling distance away, and Silas had nobody to invite, and there was something honest about doing it without ceremony, without an audience for a thing that was, at its core, just two people deciding. Berta Crane heard about it afterward and sent a jar of preserves to the ranch with a note that said, "Only congratulations to you both," which Eliza understood was the most Berta Crane was capable of and accepted it as such. Holloway sent nothing. She had not expected him to. The summer that followed was not without its difficulties, because summer on an Iron Hollow ranch was not the kind of life that offered itself easily. There was a problem with the north fence in July that took 2 weeks and more money than was comfortable to fix. There was a dispute with the county water office in August that Eliza handled in person, and that required 3 visits and a letter she spent an evening drafting with a precision she usually reserved for ledgers. There were mornings when the work was hard and the weather was harder, and one or both of them was tired in a way that made even the small distances between people feel wider than usual. On one of those evenings, a hot August night, when the day had been long and something small had gone wrong in the way that small things do when you are already stretched, she said something short and not kind, and he said something back that was more honest than diplomatic, and they sat in the kitchen for 20 minutes, not speaking, and then she said, "I'm sorry. I was tired and I said it badly." He looked at her for a moment. "I wasn't wrong either." "No, but you could have said it differently." "Yes," he said, "I could have." They made the coffee and started over. It was not graceful, and it was not perfect, and it was exactly what it needed to be. 2 imperfect people who had chosen each other not because the choosing was easy, but because the alternative, which was not choosing, was something neither of them was willing to do anymore. By September, Iron Hollow Ranch was running better than it had in years, possibly ever, by some measures. The accounts were clean. The supplier contracts were renegotiated. The kitchen garden had produced more than Eliza had expected, including the lavender, which had come up slow and stubborn and fragrant against the south wall of the house, not useful for anything much. She cut a small bunch of it and put it in a glass on the kitchen windowsill next to her mother's photograph, and the 2 things sat together in the morning light, and she looked at them sometimes while the coffee was brewing and did not try to reduce what she felt about that to a manageable size. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been in October, the woman who had read a notice on a community board with $12 in her pocket and had allowed herself, very carefully, to hope for the bare minimum: a room, a door, the basic dignity of being taken at face value. She had gotten more than she hoped for, Not because she had been lucky, exactly. Luck was what happened to you. What she had gotten was something she had worked for and chosen, and at a crucial moment on a March porch, refused to walk away from. Not because she had nowhere to go, but because the cost of going would have been paid out of something she had only just found and could not afford to lose. She thought about Gerald Fitch's letter sometimes. Not with bitterness, she had been surprised to find that the bitterness had largely burned off, the way things do when enough time passes and enough other things accumulate. What she thought about was the version of herself who had stood in the ashen ruin of the Millfield schoolhouse holding that letter, and had not cried. Who had been operating in that hard, quiet, dangerous place beyond tears, where you force yourself to think clearly anyway. That woman had made a decision with almost nothing available to her, had written a letter to a stranger in Wyoming with $12 and a terminated contract and a 2-shawl coat, and had said, "I am practical, organized, capable of hard work, and I have no illusions about frontier living," and had meant every word, and had arrived to find that the stranger had been equally honest in return, had offered a spare room that was not spare, had said the choice would remain yours, and had meant it the way you have to mean it for it to be true. Both of them had been, in their separate ways, at the end of something when October began. Both had been living in the aftermath of loss and damage and the specific loneliness of people who have learned to operate well independently because they haven't had another option. Both had arrived at Iron Hollow, he by staying when everything else had gone, with the bare minimum, and had discovered something neither of them had been looking for. Not rescue, nothing so simple or so flattering, something more like recognition. The specific moment when someone sees the actual shape of you, not the version the Whisper campaign built, not the version your worst day produced, not the version that is useful or convenient, and does not look away. On a September evening when the light was doing that flat, honest Western thing again, and the lavender was still faintly fragrant against the south wall, Silas came in from the last walk of the property and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the photograph and the lavender and the ledger open on the table, and he looked at her and he said, "Good day." She considered it. "Productive," she said. "The feed calculation's done for winter, and the lavender is going to come back next year, I can tell." "That's good." "Moderately good. It's not useful for anything." "It's useful to you," he said. "That's enough." She turned the page in the ledger. "Make the coffee," she said. He moved into the kitchen without ceremony and did exactly that. And the coffee did not burn because he had been practicing, and the September evening settled over Iron Hollow Ranch in the way that evenings settle over places that have found their footing, quietly, without announcement, as though it had always been this way and intended to keep being. Outside, the south fence held, the lavender held, the accounts were in order and the land was theirs, and the morning would bring more work, and some of it would be hard, and they would not always manage it gracefully, and they both knew that. They had chosen this anyway. That was the whole of it. That was all it ever was, and all it needed to be, two people who had run out of easier options and found, in the running out, that the thing they had almost missed was the only thing that had ever really been worth choosing. The coffee was ready. She closed the ledger. The light held for a few more minutes, the way it does in September when the season is changing and the days are getting shorter but aren't there yet, still fighting for the last of the light before the dark comes in. Neither of them wasted those last minutes.